And here's what really frightens me, Sam, that I see the possibility that two established authoritarians and one aspiring authoritarian, that these three rulers could be thinking about dividing up the world into three separate imperial regions.
What?
That's right. So let's talk about Putin and Russia. Putin, for decades, has been the dictator of Russia. You know, there are sham elections that take place in Russia. There are sham opinion polls, but none of that matters. He has total control over Russian government and society and has had it for a very long time, rigging elections, stifling dissent in sometimes violent ways, punishing his enemies, sometimes in violent ways through at least imprisonment, and there are certainly credible allegations that he retaliates violently, even lethally, against his enemies. But what there is no question about is that he has imposed a solid one-person authoritarian rule over Russia. And it's very hard to dislodge that. How much democratic tradition does Russia have? No, virtually none. You knew that. Before the Soviets took over, it was the czars, authoritarian rulers, who ruled Russia. Then the Soviets ruled Russia, you know, from 1920 through 1991. Then you had a very brief respite, you know, barely a decade of limited democracy before Putin took over and snuffed out democracy in Russia. So it's not as if Putin is out of step with the history of his country, which has been one of fairly consistent authoritarianism. Not that Russia isn't a great country in many ways. I've been there many times. I love the people. I love the culture. I even love the food, believe it or not, although Russia is not necessarily known for its food. But sadly, it doesn't really have a democratic tradition, and Putin is very much in sync with that history. But don't just take my word for it. There are independent international organizations that rate countries according to freedom and democracy. One of the most respectable and the most credible is Freedom House. And here's how they rate Russia under Putin. Global freedom. How does freedom in Russia compare to freedom around the world? The highest rating is 100. Some nations come close to that. Russia gets a 12.
12?
A 12.
That's not good.
Yeah, if you would say 65 is passing, they are not even close. They're not even in the stadium when it comes to freedom. Then they specifically are looking at something very important in today's world, internet freedom. They rate a little bit better, but not much, 20 out of 100.
Yikes.
And here's the most incredible one of all about authoritarian regimes. 100 is the highest.
Yeah.
They rate 1.
No.
1?
1?
I'm not sure anyone rates 0. Maybe North Korea.
Maybe North Korea.
1.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
This is just astonishing, you know. And if you look further, you know, at their 12 rating on freedom, it gets even worse. Political rights, critical for any regime, any authoritarian regime to snuff that out. 4 out of 40. 4 out of 40. Civil liberties, 8 out of 60. And, you know, there are other rating organizations that similarly rate Russia grossly failing grades when it comes to democracy, freedom, fair elections.
Right.
Now, it's beyond just Putin being an authoritarian and snuffing out the free press, suppressing his political opponents, destroying free elections. He is also a very aggressive authoritarian, backed by a military that we actually thought was a lot stronger than it's proven to be in the war in Ukraine. You know, the Ukraine resisting for so many years what was thought to be, you know, the overwhelming might of the Soviet military. Nonetheless, compared to most other nations, the Soviet military is pretty strong, and Putin has shown he is willing to use military force to further his ambitions to reestablish the Soviet empire, or maybe even more broadly, an empire that rules not just in Eastern Europe, but across Europe altogether. He is responsible directly, gratuitously, by choice, for the two major wars in Europe in the 21st century. First one isn't well known, but it's very important. 2008, the invasion of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, now an independent nation, invaded by Putin's armies. It wasn't nearly as long or as bloody a war as the war in Ukraine, but still thousands were killed. And while the estimates are difficult, estimates rise as high as 200,000 persons being displaced as a result of the ethnic cleansing that Putin was enforcing in Georgia. And then, of course, the second war of choice, gratuitous, aggressive, the invasion of Ukraine. Putin directly responsible for the two major wars in Europe in our own time. Now, as I said, his ambitions are not limited to Ukraine and Georgia. He clearly has much greater ambitions, as I said, to recreate the old Russian or Soviet empire. And here's what really frightens me, Sam.
Oh.
That I see the possibility that two established authoritarians and one perhaps aspiring authoritarian, and this is pure speculation, but it's based on studying history for well over 50 years, that these three rulers could be thinking about dividing up the world into three separate imperial regions.
What?
That's right.
You think so?
Who are the three that I'm talking about?
Trump,
Xi, and Putin. And Trump, of course, is the aspiring authoritarian. And we've seen signs of this with Trump trying to buy Greenland, trying to get the Panama Canal back from Panama, making deals with authoritarian rulers in Latin America. Of course, we've seen this with Putin's aggression in Europe, and we've seen this with the big Chinese buildup in the Far East, which threatens other nations in that region. Again, I'm speculating here. You know, there isn't firm, concrete proof, but it's reasonable speculation based upon history and based upon what we know about these three rulers. Now, Sam, you reminded me of something, right?
What
Trump said after Putin launched that vicious bombing attack on Kyiv.
He said stop or whatever.
Yeah, and what are the consequences of that?
Nothing.
Nothing. It makes it look like Trump is standing up to Putin when, in fact, he's
been as
taking nothing
wishy-washy
from
as possible with Putin.
What was that?
I said he's been as wishy-washy at best with possible.
I would say more than wishy-washy.
Right.
Again, I'm not the world's greatest expert in foreign affairs, but I know something about it. And there are lots of experts who said what basically Trump has done with respect to the war in Ukraine is try to settle the war strictly on Putin's terms, right?
Yeah.
Concede Crimea to Putin, which he illegally seized in 2014, and then cede to Russia all the other territories that they also illegally seized as a result of their invasion of Ukraine. You know, this was one UN member gratuitously, aggressively invading another UN member. That doesn't happen all that often. Second time Putin has done it. First was the invasion of Georgia, of course. Another egregious example of this was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Do you remember who was president back then during the Kuwait invasion?
Bill Clinton.
Close. George H.W. Bush. A Republican. And did we just sort of turn our eyes and say, you know, no big deal, you know, who cares what Saddam Hussein has done? No. We organized a military operation, boots on the ground, to expel Saddam Hussein from Iraq, going on our high horse saying, you know, one UN member should not gratuitously and aggressively invade another. This is a Republican who did this. It also gave us our first war hero since the Korean War, Stormin' Norman Schwarzkopf. It also presented a very interesting question for H.W. Bush and his top advisors, Colin Powell and Dick Cheney, whether they should go to Baghdad and topple Saddam. And they decided not to, because if you topple Saddam, who owns Iraq? We do.
Well, then they did it.
And then the same advisors
did it with W. Bush.
Under W. Bush. That's one of the great ironies of history. But, you know, where is the outrage now about one UN member aggressively, gratuitously invading another and trying to take over their territory? Trump has given so much to Putin while getting nothing in return that he has become the favorite, the champion as seen by Russian state media. They are very explicit about this. Here is one commentator who said, quote, "No one could have imagined we would live to see the day where the correct answer about to whom Crimea belongs would come from the President of the United States. And he will not only give it to us, but will also teach the President of Ukraine what this correct answer is." I haven't seen anything like this since Neville Chamberlain at the notorious Appeasement Munich Conference in 1938 ceded the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to Hitler. This is astounding. This is the Soviet state media. But don't stop here. A military expert in Russia said, quote, "The United States may withdraw its entire military contingent from Europe and remove American tactical nuclear weapons from the European NATO bases. We will then see a totally new political reality when Europe will be left one-on-one with Russia," unquote. These are Russian official sources. This is not some bleeding heart liberal in the United States. So, you know, my theory about carving up the world into these three spheres of influence is not without foundation, Sam.
Oh.
You know, listen to what Russian state media is saying.
Right.
They're essentially saying, we do believe that the United States is going to let Europe become a Russian sphere of influence. And then clearly Putin is going to let the Western Hemisphere become a U.S. sphere of influence. The real question is what's going to happen in the Far East with China. If China gets aggressive in the South China Sea or with respect to Taiwan, what is the United States, if anything, going to do?